cubic meters per year. And we think this is absolutely crazy, insane, and very irresponsible. And so our group, along with a lot of other groups in the province, have been asking for a full public inquiry on forestry that would help us determine what is truly sustainable in terms of what we can log from our public forests. I might comment on the private forest. There's no regulation of logging on private lands, and it'd just be disastrous to increase logging, like was suggested this morning, on private lands. This is a more detailed look at numbers by TSA for the province. And the numbers indicate that we're overcommitted by 30% province-wide. In the Nelson region, we're overcommitted by 25%. And these are all based on Ministry of Forests numbers. There's some other factors that are taking place. We're generally seeing a move towards higher utilization in the sawmills, whereas the sawmills are cutting more efficiently, and they're getting into cutting smaller dimensions, finger joining, chipboard, fuel chips, and that sort of product, which means that there's going to be less wood available as residual chip material. And there's also the fall down effect and the growing recognition that a lot of the tree plantations are not working as well as was projected. In other words, the trees aren't really going to produce as much merchantable wood at the end of 15 years as we thought, or at the end of 80 years or 100 years as we formerly thought. Another thing that I want to bring to your attention is that the Southeast Fiber Study that Celgar is using to base their estimate of wood supply on is largely obsolete now. And the detailed studies that are being done in the Kootenai Lake TSA, for example, are showing that there's going to be a decrease of 15 to 30% in those estimates. And the consultants that we have approached are indicating that that's also true for the Arrow TSA and other areas within the wood supply area that Celgar is proposing to use. I already mentioned that there's been an inadequate allowance for other values such as wildlife habitat, old growth forest, and that sort of thing taking place. There's a growing call from the public to preserve a representative amount of the remaining old growth forest for biological studies, for baseline ecological studies, and also just to keep some of it the way it was rather than assuming that we know enough to put everything into tree plantations. It's also important to recognize then what nature needs as well as what the mill needs. And we need very much to look at the need to preserve biological diversity. There's an increasing amount of talk about that. There's a lot of other forms of life on this planet besides human beings, and we very much need to look after them as well as us. And one thing that's come out in the research recently is the need for leaving woody debris in the forest. We used to think that there was way too much wood being left in the woods after logging, and now the studies are showing that it's very important for the mycorrhizal fungus and the ecological processes, which we're just starting to begin to understand. It's very important to leave some of the wood there so that the forest ecosystem can regenerate and recover after being clear-cut logged. Now, the last point regarding wood supply is what are the people saying? I'm sure you're familiar with the Environics poll, which the Canadian the Forest Service did. What are the most important uses of Canadian forests? The question was asked people across Canada, and the answers are represented up here. Wilderness preservation and wildlife protection was the answer given by more than half the people. And the red area here, some 12%, was for logging. Another question here regarding the issue of preserving forests or ensuring jobs. 64% of the people responded that preserving the forest was more important than ensuring jobs. And in terms of selection logging, the people responding said that they would like to see more selection logging. And all the green area here, 53% saying it's very important, 32% saying it's somewhat important. So we're going to see a trend towards more selection logging, like the 3 village governments in the Celgar Valley calling for an end to clear-cut logging in their area. A more recent poll conducted by Decima Research and published in Maclean's magazine, this current issue, indicated that 46% of the people in British Columbia would like to see an end to logging the mature forest, all that remains. That's old growth in BC. It was higher Canada-wide, it was 56% want to see an end to logging the old growth forest. So this is what the public are calling for, and we hope that you consider that along with the company's requests. In terms of jobs, I'd just like to go through a few numbers on the annual cut compared to jobs. And there's been a trend towards a reduction in employment, while at the same time the use of the forest in terms of wood harvested has gone up. The orange line is the use of the wood, and the employment is the black line. Another figure which is important to take into consideration is the amount of public revenue which comes from the public forests, and our analysis of the amount of public revenue, net revenue, that was realized by British Columbia for all of its crown land was about $1.88 per cubic meter versus $16 per cubic meter in the United States, U.S. national forests. It's a little better this last year than the year before, when there was only 2 cents per cubic meter realized in BC. There is a direct correlation between forest jobs and value added. What's being proposed today is not that much value added. What we need to do is look at how to get the most out of our wood. And the pulp mills generally don't create very many jobs per the amount of wood cut. So you can see the relationship here between what we have in BC and what's in the United States, the 2 bar charts on the left, where BC is much, much less, both in terms of adding value to the forest products and in terms of providing jobs. It's about 1 job per million cubic meters, and 1,000 cubic meters, I'm sorry, in BC versus 3.4 jobs per 1,000 cubic meters in the United States. And in terms of Canada, we don't do very well either in relation to the overall Canadian average, where it's 0.67 versus 1.5. In terms of the number of jobs here, we have the direct employment of 1.05 per 1,000 cubic meters in BC. Canada is 2.2. I'm sorry, Canada overall is 1.67. United States is 3.55. New Zealand is 5, and Sweden is 2.52. And the last transparency here illustrates the present situation of the Celgar mill in terms of relating the number of jobs. Present mill, expanded mill is 30 more. It's pretty much the same, but the increase in fiber is proposed to be increased from a little over 1 million cubic meters to almost 2.5 million cubic meters. It doesn't say much for creating jobs or making the most out of the forest products. So that is the end of my presentation, and I'd like to turn it over to Anne at this point.
I wonder if they'd like to ask you some questions before I talk.
Why don't you finish your whole presentation, and then we'll come back to questions.
Well, I'd like to talk on the pollution side of it. I'd like to look at the provincial picture and then see where Celgar fits into it. There's 4 main things happening in the pulp industry today that are very much in the public awareness. And the first one is that it's just in the last few years that it's really come out to the public that pulp mills have been dumping tons of dangerous and often very toxic chemicals into our waters. And apparently the government, the Canadian government, has known this since the late 70s or the early 1980s, but nobody ever told the public. And in the last year or two, the first we hear about it, our fisheries are starting to be closed because they have absorbed so much dioxins and furans that the fish are no longer safe to eat. Now, right as we start to discover this, there are more studies done, and I have one study here that's done by the Pulp, Paper, and Woodworkers of Canada Union. And when you read this study, which I've sent the panel a copy of this study, you have no doubt that our backs are up against the wall as far as organochlorine intake. Organochlorine is one of the pollutants of chief concern in pulp mill effluents. And we're finding out that they cause cancer. We're finding out that some of them cause birth defects. We're finding out that they cause liver damage and brain damage and a whole ton of horrible effects that we're just now, the public is just now starting to find out about these. Now, I want to read just briefly a section from this report because it puts it in language better than I can. All Canadians now carry levels of organochlorines in their bodies which are close to the levels which have been shown to cause adverse health effects in experimental animals. Workers in the BC pulp and paper industry currently face an increased risk of dying from some forms of cancer almost 4 times that of the general population. A breastfed infant receives 100 times the maximum tolerable daily intake of dioxin specified by the World Health Organization and 10 times the maximum acceptable daily intake specified by the Canadian Department of Health and Welfare. The Canadian pulp and paper industry has clearly indicated to the provincial and federal governments that it does not intend to willingly cease the discharge of organochlorines into the environment, that a 50 to 60% reduction in these pollutants will provide adequate protection of the environment, They have selected research material to justify this position, a position which appears to have been largely influenced by comparing environmental and health risks on a balance sheet with yearly profits. This is known as cost-benefit analysis, but one should ask themselves, who is paying the cost and who is receiving the benefits? This was written by the people whose jobs are most at stake. It's written by pulp mill workers. And if they're concerned like this and they're alerting the public, I think that we should be terribly concerned. Just to fit Celgar into that, with the expansion, by taking the figures that Celgar has issued in its report, they'll be cleaning up some of their organochlorine discharge, yes, but when the expansion is added on to that, it appears that their reduction of organochlorines in their effluent and their air discharge may be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. And this report is telling us it's not good enough. A few facts to put Celgar in the picture. The pulp and paper workers did a search of cancer literature and came up with 16 pulp mill areas where the school children had elevated rates of cancer, some forms of cancer. And Celgar is one of those areas. There was elevated rates of 3 kinds of cancer in Celgar school children. So I think that's reason for a very grave concern. Recently in BC, it's been discovered that organochlorines have gotten into the water supplies of municipalities which are downstream from BC pulp mills. And in some cases, this was known apparently for some time, and the residents were not even told that these deadly, in some cases very deadly poisons were in their water supply, in their drinking water. Now, I've read the Celgar report, and as best I can tell from reading that report, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any test of the drinking water in Celgar. There are 2 wells downstream from the mill, 4 kilometers, that are used when the demand on the water supply is heavy. And Celgar says in its report that no test has been made of these wells for whether or not organochlorines could have gotten into those wells. So these are things that are of extreme concern. Particularly if you're a mother carrying a child, if you're a mother nursing a child, if it's a national health crisis that should be taken extremely seriously. And the pulp and paper workers give us the urgent message that they demand that the government set a short timetable for absolute elimination of chlorine gas from the pulp making process, because that is what results in the formation of organochlorines. Now, at the same time, the second thing that's happening as this goes on is that the BC and the federal governments are promising us stricter regulations. Everybody should know that those regulations are only being talked about. And they are, as far as we have been able to determine, inadequate, because they have not set any timetable for the complete elimination of organochlorines. They've only talked about reducing them. And as far as that goes, a new mill, which would be the size of the mill which Celgar is contemplating, 1,200 tons a day. A mill like that would have until 1994 to limit their organochlorine discharge to 700 tons a year. Now, these are chemicals where you can take one drop of that chemical and you can mix it with 38 you can make 38 drops of that chemical and mix it with 1 quadrillion drops of water. And that has been shown to kill fish in 28 days. That's how incredibly toxic some of these chemicals are in minute amounts. And our promised BC regulations, which are being waffled on right now and which never have really come to pass, they will limit the discharge of these chemicals to 700 tons a year, and that's what one new mill could produce. So the third thing that is happening is that new technology has been developed, is available today, is economically feasible to eliminate organochlorine discharge.